The letter arrived on a Tuesday. That part matters, because in Colton Ridge, New Mexico, in the year 1887, nothing ever arrived on a Tuesday. The post rider came Thursdays. Everybody knew that. The postmaster, old Gerald Fitch, had been keeping that schedule for 11 years without a single exception. But on a Tuesday morning in late April, a single envelope appeared beneath the door of the Colton Ridge post office. No postmark, no return address, no stamp. Just a name written on the front in handwriting so precise it looked like it had been carved rather than drawn. For Elias Cade. Gerald held it for 3 days. He told himself he was waiting for Elias to come into town. But the truth was, Gerald was afraid of it. Afraid of what a letter with no postmark meant in a town that had already buried 4 men that spring, all of them connected, in one way or another, to a man named Elias Cade. When Elias finally did ride in that Thursday, Gerald handed it over without a word. Watched the man's jaw tighten as he read it. Watched something move behind those pale gray eyes, not quite fear. Something older than fear. Elias folded the letter once, twice, tucked it inside his coat, and walked out without buying a single thing. He rode back to his land. 12 acres of high desert at the edge of the territory. And sitting on that land, not yet 2 months finished, was the house he had built with his own hands. Every board planed smooth. Every nail driven straight. A porch facing east so the morning light would come in gentle. A garden plot staked out with string. A second bedroom that didn't need to exist yet, but did. He had sent the letter to the agency in St. Louis 6 weeks ago. The reply had come back fast. A woman named Clara Marsh, age 26, willing to travel, strong constitution, no family to speak of. He had written back immediately. Send her. But the letter inside his coat said something different. Something that changed everything. It said she's already on her way. And so are we. No signature. Just those 2 lines. Elias stood on his new porch in the April heat and looked out at the horizon, and asked himself the question that would define the next 30 days of his life. Was he willing to let her walk into all of this? Elias Cade had come to Colton Ridge 3 years before anybody thought to ask where he'd come from. That was the thing about the West in those days. A man could arrive with nothing but a horse and a name, and if he kept his hands busy and his mouth shut, people would eventually stop wondering. The territory swallowed stories whole. It had to. Half the men who'd ever set foot in New Mexico were running from something, and the other half were running towards something they couldn't name. Either way, nobody had much energy left over for curiosity. Elias was 34 years old when he first hammered a survey stake into the red clay at the edge of his 12 acres. He was lean in the way that hard men get lean, not from hunger but from constant use, like a piece of rope that's been pulled taut for so long it's forgotten how to go slack. His hands were large and scarred across the knuckles. His hair was dark with early silver threading through at the temples. His eyes were the color of winter sky, that pale, flat gray that gives away nothing. He had purchased the land legitimately, through a territorial deed, paying cash from a leather pouch he never opened in front of anyone. Where the cash came from, nobody knew. Nobody asked? Gerald Fitch noted the transaction in the county record book and moved on. The first year, Elias lived in a canvas tent and worked the ground. He wasn't farming. The soil out that far was too alkaline for anything serious. He was clearing. Moving rock. Leveling the earth in a rough rectangle 60 feet by 40. Neighbors, what few there were out that way, saw him working at dawn and still working at dusk, and assumed he was building something. They were right. But the scale of it, when it finally started to rise, surprised everyone. It wasn't a homesteader's shack. It wasn't a bunkhouse. It was a house, proper and deliberate, with a rail foundation of fitted stone, with framed windows and a plank floor and a chimney built from the same red rock he'd cleared from the site. He milled his own lumber from timber hauled down from the mountains 40 miles north, paying a freight driver named Hooks Pelham to make 6 separate trips. He paid Hooks in cash each time, and each time Hooks drove away shaking his head, unsure whether to be impressed or unsettled. By the second year, the frame was up. By the third, the house was finished. And it was finished well, the kind of finish that takes intention. The kind that suggests whoever built it was thinking not just about shelter but about permanence. About a life taking root rather than just taking cover. What nobody in Colton Ridge knew was what Elias thought about while he built it. He thought about a woman's name he didn't know yet. He thought about a porch that faced east. He thought about a table set for two and a lamp burning in a window and the ordinary, impossible luxury of not being alone. He had spent the better part of 15 years being alone, by necessity first, then by habit, and finally by something that felt almost like choice, though he suspected it wasn't. You don't choose solitude the way you choose a horse or a coat. You fall into it the way you fall into a river, and eventually you stop fighting the current. But the house changed something in him. The act of building it. Because a house isn't a shelter, not really. A shelter is temporary. A house is a statement. It says, I intend to be here. I intend to matter. I intend to be known. And Elias Cade, for the first time in a very long time, wanted to be known. He sent the letter to the St. Louis agency on a cold morning in March, 2 days after the last nail went into the last piece of trim on the front porch. He had written it out 4 times before getting the words right. Simple words. Honest ones. I am a man of some means. I have built a house. I am looking for a partner in life, not a servant. I will be fair. I will be faithful. I will work hard every day to be worth the trust. What he did not write, what he could not write, because some things don't fit in envelopes, was the rest of it. The 15 years. The name he used to carry. The reason he'd come to this particular edge of the territory, and not some other. The reason men had died this spring. And why the letter that arrived on a Tuesday, with no postmark and no signature, had made his blood run cold in a way that nothing had in a very long time. He stood on that finished porch in the April heat and tried to decide if what he'd built was a home, or a trap. The train out of St. Louis smelled like coal smoke, leather, and other people's anxiety. Clara Marsh sat in the second-to-last car with her traveling bag between her feet and her hands folded in her lap. Watching the Missouri flatlands give way to the wide brown sprawl of Kansas, and trying very hard to look like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She did not know exactly what she was doing. She was 26 years old, which in 1887 meant she had already been called a spinster by people who thought that word was helpful. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a printer who died of influenza when she was 19, leaving her a modest inheritance that had lasted exactly 4 years before the city swallowed it. She had worked as a seamstress, then as a bookkeeper for a hardware merchant, then, briefly, mortifyingly, as a piano accompanist at a hotel restaurant where the tips were insulting and the piano was always slightly out of tune. She was not a desperate woman. She wanted to be clear about that, at least in her own mind, because desperation felt like surrender, and Clara Marsh had not yet surrendered to anything. She was a practical woman. Practical enough to recognize that her options in St. Louis were narrowing the way a river narrows before a falls, gradual at first, then suddenly, terrifyingly fast. Practical enough to walk into the matrimonial agency on Chestnut Street and fill out the questionnaire without trembling. Are you in good health? Yes. Can you cook? Adequately. Can you ride a horse? I can learn. Are you willing to relocate to the Western Territories? Yes. That last one she'd answered without hesitating, which had surprised her. She'd thought about it afterward, alone in her one-room apartment above a cobbler's shop, trying to identify what had made the yes come so easily. What she'd arrived at was this: she was not afraid of hard things. She'd had a life full of them. Hard things had texture. Hard things meant you were alive and moving and present in the world. It was the soft things that terrified her, the slow, padded, comfortable diminishment of a life unlived. The agency had sent her 3 profiles. She'd read all 3 and written back about only one. Elias Cade. Age 34. Colton Ridge, New Mexico Territory. Owns property. Has built a house. No prior marriages. References: Gerald Fitch, Colton Ridge Postmaster. Something about the specificity had caught her. Has built a house. Not owns a house, has built one. With his hands. There was something in that she couldn't quite articulate but felt strongly. A man who builds a house from the ground up is betting on the future. He's laying his faith into the earth one board at a time. You can lie in a letter, but you can't lie with 12 months of labor. She'd written to him. He'd written back. 3 letters total, each one careful and measured, not cold, but considered. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He didn't describe himself as more than he was. He said, "I will be honest with you. I will expect honesty in return. The rest we can figure out together." She had liked that. The rest we can figure out together. It was the most romantic thing a man had ever said to her, and it wasn't romantic at all. It was just true. She hadn't told him she was coming early. The agency had scheduled her departure for mid-May, but Clara had moved it up 3 weeks without notifying anyone, a small, impulsive act driven by something she couldn't name. Something that felt like impatience but wasn't quite. More like urgency. Like the feeling you get when you're standing at a high window and the latch gives, and suddenly you have to decide right now whether to grab it or let it swing open. The train rocked westward through the afternoon. The light changed as the landscape changed, broader, sharper, more committed to its own severity. Less green. More sky. Clara watched it all and felt something she hadn't expected. She felt like she was going home. She didn't know yet what was waiting for her there. She didn't know about the letter with no postmark. She didn't know about the 4 dead men. She didn't know that the house she was riding toward had been built in silence, by a man carrying a weight that had nothing to do with lumber. She would learn all of it. But first, the train rolled on through the copper-colored afternoon, and Clara Marsh watched the sky open up ahead of her like a question she'd already decided to answer. The unsigned letter said 2 things. She's already on her way. And so are we. Elias had read it 20 times in the 4 days since Gerald Fitch had pressed it into his hand. He'd read it by lamplight and by daylight, and once, teeth clenched, by the light of a match he'd nearly burned his fingers on. Each reading confirmed what the first had told him: someone knew about Clara. Someone knew she was coming. And whoever had written those 2 lines wanted Elias to know that they knew. It was a move. He recognized it the way you recognize a chess move from a player who's been 3 steps ahead of you for a very long time. Not a threat, not yet. A demonstration. Look how much I know. Look how close I can get. Look what I can touch. The name he was thinking of was Decker Munn. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in 6 years. Had barely allowed himself to think it, the way you avoid looking directly at something bright enough to damage your eyes. Decker Munn was a man Elias had known in another life, under another name. In a different part of the territory when both of them were younger, and the West was wilder, and the things you did to survive had a different moral weight than they did in memory. Elias had not always been a man who built houses. There had been years, 5 of them, starting when he was 23, when he had ridden with a group of men who operated on the blurry line between hired protection and armed robbery. Not a gang, precisely. More like a contractor's firm with guns. They had a code, and they kept to it most of the time, and when they didn't, Elias had told himself the same lie that all men in that situation tell themselves: it was necessary. He had walked away when he was 28. Not because of one specific thing. It was more like watching water wear a stone. Slow, incremental, until one morning you look at yourself in a creek reflection and realize the stone is nearly gone. He had walked away, changed his name from Jacob Rourke to Elias Cade, moved territory, and spent the next 6 years building the kind of man he thought he could live with. Decker Munn had never walked away. Decker had grown. Gotten harder and sharper and more dangerous in the way that men do when they're both intelligent and without conscience, like a blade that keeps finding the whetstone. He ran a significant operation now, if the rumors Elias picked up from passing riders were true. Land grabs, mostly. Forcing homesteaders out, buying deed rights for almost nothing, reselling to railroad speculators. Legal enough on the surface. Violent in the execution. The 4 men who died in Colton Ridge that spring had all held land deeds for territory adjacent to Elias's 12 acres. He hadn't put that together until the second death. By the third, he was certain. By the fourth, he'd started sleeping with a rifle across his legs. Someone, Deckerman, he was nearly sure, wanted his 12 acres. And they'd been removing everyone around him, one by one, so that when the final pressure came, Elias would be standing alone with no neighbors, no allies. No one to notice or care if his name got added to the list. The land wasn't worth enough for that kind of effort on its own merits. Which meant Decker wanted something else, wanted Elias specifically, for reasons that reached back through 6 years of silence to a shared history that Elias had believed was buried. He spent 3 days deciding what to do about Clara. He could write to the agency and cancel. He could send word ahead, meet her at the station in El Paso and tell her the truth and put her back on the next train east. He could fold the whole thing up and turn it back in, the house and the garden plot and the porch facing east, everything he'd stacked his quietly desperate hope on. He thought about that seriously. He told himself it was the right thing. The safe thing. The thing a man did when he actually cared about the woman involved. But then, on the third day, he did something he hadn't planned on doing. He rode into town, had a drink at the saloon, and asked Gerald Fitch a careful question: had any strangers been through town recently, asking about the land to the west? Gerald's answer was long and nervously delivered, but the heart of it was this: yes. 3 men. 2 weeks ago. They'd asked about Elias by name. And one of them, Gerald said, lowering his voice, had been asking which train the woman from St. Louis would arrive on. They already knew about Clara. They knew she was coming. Sending her away wouldn't protect her. If Deckerman was making a move, Clara Marsh was already on the board. Elias rode home in the dark and sat on his east-facing porch and made a decision that a better man might not have made. A decision he couldn't be entirely sure was right, or if it was right for the right reasons. He would let her come. And he would be ready. The stagecoach from El Paso rattled into Colton Ridge at 11 in the morning on a Wednesday, coated in red dust and the particular exhaustion of 23 miles of bad road. Clara Marsh was the only passenger who stepped down into the street without looking relieved to have survived. She stood on the hard-packed earth of Colton Ridge's single main street and looked around with open, steady eyes, taking the measure of the place the way a carpenter takes the measure of a room before deciding where to start. A general store. A saloon with a broken shutter. A livery stable. A post office with peeling paint. 12 buildings total, by her count, strung along both sides of the street like beads on a wire someone had pulled almost taut. Small. Dry. Sun-bleached to within an inch of its life. She thought, yes. Elias was waiting beside the post office with a hat in his hands, turning it by the brim. She identified him from 20 feet away, not from any physical feature she'd been told about, but from the way he was standing. Still, but not relaxed. Watchful, but trying not to appear so. A man carrying something invisible that required constant, careful balance. She walked toward him. He saw her coming and stopped, turning the hat. "Miss Marsh," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had been trained by long silences. "Mr. Cade." She looked at him directly. He looked back. "You're younger than I expected," she said. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the muscular memory of one. "You're taller. Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's fine." It wasn't the romantic arrival she might have once imagined, before life had stripped that particular fantasy down to its useful components. But it was real, and Clara had decided long ago that real was worth more than romantic in almost every category that mattered. He had borrowed a wagon to carry her trunk. They drove out of town in relative silence, which Clara found she didn't mind. She was looking at the land, the high red desert rolling away under a sky so wide it seemed structural, like it was the thing holding everything else up. She had expected to feel small under it. Instead, she felt clarified. Like the extra information of her old life had been stripped away and what remained was simply herself, present and undeniable. The house appeared around a long curve of the trail, and Clara stopped breathing for a moment. It was beautiful. Not grand, it wasn't trying to be grand. But it was right, in the way that a thing is right when someone has thought carefully about what it needs to be and then done exactly that. The proportions were good. The stone foundation sat solid and level. The porch faced east the way he mentioned in one of his letters, so the morning light comes in gentle, and she had not expected to feel that detail as sharply as she did. Like a hand extended in the specific direction of her comfort. She stepped down from the wagon before he could offer a hand and walked up the porch steps and through the open front door. The interior smelled like cut timber and lantern oil, and something she couldn't name, something like waiting. The floors were smooth. The windows were real glass. There was a table with 2 chairs. A cast iron stove. A braided rug on the floor that had clearly been bought rather than made, the pattern slightly too uniform, and she made a note to herself that she could do better. She walked through each room in order. Said nothing. Touched the door frames. Looked at the joints in the ceiling beams. Stood in the second bedroom doorway for a long moment, aware of what it meant that this room existed, and that he had built it anyway. Elias stood in the front doorway, hat still in hand, watching her. She came back to the main room and faced him. "You built this alone?" she said. "Mostly. It took you about 2 years, working at it steady." She looked around the room again. Something in her chest was doing something unfamiliar, not sentimental, exactly. More like recognition. The feeling of meeting something you didn't know you'd been looking for. "It's a good house," she said. And then, before she could examine the impulse, she said, "It feels like home." He looked at her with those gray eyes. And she could see something moving behind them, relief and fear in equal measure, tangled up together so tightly she doubted even he could separate them. "I need to tell you something," he said. Before you unpack or—" He stopped. Started again. "There are some things I didn't put in my letters. Things you have a right to know." Clara looked at him steadily. "All right," she said. "Tell me." He told her. Not all of it, not yet, but the bones of it. The men who died. The unsigned letter. The name Deckerman, and what that name meant, and why it mattered. He watched her face as he spoke, looking for the moment she'd decide she'd made a mistake. The moment the calculation would shift, and the reality of what she'd walked into would become heavier than the promise of what it could be. That moment never came. Clara listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long breath. "Did you write to me knowing this was coming?" she asked. "I wrote to you before I knew." "The letter came after. And you let me come anyway. They already knew about you," he said. "Stopping you wouldn't have kept you safe. It would have just kept you far away while you were in danger." She considered this. She wasn't sure she entirely believed it. She was sharp enough to hear the part of the reasoning that was also just want, the desire to not give up the thing he built this house for. She filed that observation away without judgment. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. He blinked. He had clearly not expected that question. She raised her chin slightly. "I'm not leaving. I just arrived. And I told you in my first letter, I'm not afraid of hard things. So tell me what you need." Elias Kate stood in the doorway of the house he had built with 2 years of solitary hope and looked at this woman he had known for less than 2 hours. and felt something shift inside him like a foundation stone settling into final position. "I need you to trust me," he said. "And I need to earn it fast." "Then start now," she said. "What's the plan?" They came on a Thursday, because in Colton Ridge things that mattered always seemed to happen on a day that was supposed to be ordinary. 3 riders. They appeared on the western ridge at the last good hour of light, when the sun was low enough to throw long shadows but high enough to silhouette everything in sharp relief. Elias saw them from the porch where he'd been sitting with a rifle balanced across his knees since 4 in the afternoon. He'd had the feeling all day, the particular pressure behind the eyes that his body remembered how to read, the animal awareness of proximity. He said Clara's name, once, quietly. She was inside at the table with Gerald Fitch's old county land maps spread in front of her. She'd ridden into town 2 days before, alone, and charmed the record she needed out of Gerald with a combination of directness and a piece of apple cake she'd baked that morning. That had been her idea, not Elias's, and it had impressed him more than he'd let show. Clara had spent those 2 days building something Elias had never managed in 3 years, actual relationships in Colton Ridge. She'd talked to the merchant's wife. She'd sat with the widow of the second man who died. She'd made herself known, which was the one thing Elias had consistently failed to do. At the sound of his voice, she stepped to the window. Looked where he was looking. Said nothing. "Stay inside," he said. "And if they come around the back?" He had already thought of that. He had repositioned the second rifle. She had shown him, calmly, on her second day, that she could handle a firearm, that her uncle and St. Louis had taught her, that she was accurate enough at 30 yards to be useful. He had not argued. He had shown her where the second rifle was, and they had not discussed it further because there was a mutual understanding between them now that ran below the level of words. The 3 riders came down from the ridge at a walk. Unhurried. Deliberate. The posture of men who are making a point with their bodies. "We are not afraid of you, and we want you to see that." The one in the center was a big man. Wide through the shoulders, sitting his horse with the kind of authority that comes from years of people not questioning it. He was wearing a dark coat despite the heat, and his hat was quality. The hat of a man who had money and wanted the first detail about him to be that. Decker Munn. Older than Elias remembered. The jaw heavier. The eyes still the same though, that dark, flat intelligence, the eyes of a man who processed information the way a mill processes grain, continuously, mechanically, without feeling. They stopped 20 feet from the porch. "Jacob," Decker said. The name landed like a stone in still water. Elias hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 6 years, and the effect of it was physical, a tightening across the chest, a narrowing of the world to this particular moment. "Decker," Elias said. "Not Jacob." Not conceding the name. Decker smiled. It was a careful smile, calibrated for effect. "Nice house. It suits me. 12 acres. Decker looked around slowly, the theatrical survey of a man who's rehearsed this. "You know the railroad's coming through here. Within 2 years. Maybe 18 months, way things are moving. This land, this specific stretch, it sits right in the path of the most efficient route." "You know that?" "I know it." "Then you know what it's worth." "I know what it's worth to me," Elias said. Decker's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "The men who died this spring, I want you to know, that was regrettable. Nobody had to make those choices. But when men won't negotiate, don't," Elias said. The word was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that has weight behind it. Decker tilted his head. "You've got a woman in there now. Heard she just arrived." "That's a new development." He said it without inflection, which was worse than if he'd said it with menace. The absence of menace was itself the message. Be a shame if things got complicated for her. What happened next, Elias hadn't planned. The front door opened. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was carrying a cast iron skillet, because she'd been cooking, and she hadn't set it down before coming out. And the effect of this, a tall woman in an apron standing on a porch in the dying light holding a skillet, meeting the gaze of three armed men with the calm expression of someone who finds the whole situation mildly irritating rather than terrifying, was something none of the three riders had expected. "Are you staying for supper?" Clara said, addressing Decker directly. "Because if you are, I need more time. And if you're not, I'd appreciate you finishing whatever this is. The biscuits are going to burn." A silence opened up. And in that silence, something shifted. One of the riders, the one on the right, younger, with nervous hands, actually looked at his saddle horn. Decker's expression cracked, just slightly, before he rebuilt it. The third rider made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Elias felt something wild and dangerous rising in his chest that it took him a moment to identify. It was hope. Decker looked from Clara back to Elias. The calculation was running behind those flat eyes. "This is different from what I expected. A man alone is one thing. A man and this woman, this particular woman, is a different equation." "We'll be back," Decker said. "Not tonight. But we'll be back." He turned his horse. The other two followed. They rode back up toward the ridge and disappeared over it in the last blaze of the setting sun. Elias looked at Clara. "The biscuits aren't actually burning," she said. "I just needed something to say." He looked at her for a long moment. "You could have stayed inside. You needed a witness," she said simply. "Men like that, they behave differently when there's a witness." She looked at the ridge where they'd disappeared. "He'll come back with more men." "Yes. Then we need more than 2 people and 2 rifles." She turned and went back inside. After a moment, she leaned back through the door. "Supper's in 20 minutes. And tomorrow you're going to tell me everything. Not the bones, everything. Because if I'm going to help you, I need to know what we're actually dealing with." The door swung shut. Elias sat back down in his porch chair, rifle across his knees, and stared at the place on the ridge where 3 men had been. She said we? He'd been alone for so long that the word felt foreign. Felt dangerous, even. Felt like the kind of thing you couldn't afford to count on. He counted on it anyway. The thing about Deckerman was that he was patient in the way that only dangerous men can sustain, like a drought. Long, and dry, and seemingly endless, until the moment it breaks. He came back 9 days later. Not 3 riders this time. 7. Elias had used those 9 days well, because Clara had insisted on it. She'd ridden into town 3 times. She'd talked to people. She'd done what Elias, in 3 years, had never managed to do. She'd made the town feel responsible for something. The widow of the second murdered man. The merchant who'd been quietly afraid. Gerald Fitch, who'd been sitting on enough guilt about his silence to fill his post office twice over. One by one, Clara Marsh had sat with them, had listened, had said the simple, devastating thing that needed saying: "This happened to your neighbors. It will happen to you next. The question is whether you wait for it, or you don't." She was not a woman who made speeches. She was a woman who asked the right questions and then let people answer themselves into the right position. By day 5, Gerald Fitch had sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. By day 7, the merchant's wife had persuaded her husband to stand up at a meeting of the 6 remaining male landholders in the area and formally document their land ownership and their testimony about the deaths. Witnessed and signed. By day 8, 2 of those men had agreed to be present on Elias's land if and when Decker's men came back. Elias had done his part too. He had ridden out alone on day 3 and found the man he'd been thinking about, a former lawman named Pruitt who lived in semi-retirement 12 miles south and who owed Elias a debt of a specific and non-negotiable variety. Pruitt had listened, asked 2 questions, and packed a bag. So when Deckerman rode up the trail to Elias Cade's 12 acres with 7 men at his back, he found something he had not calculated for. He found 7 people already there. Elias on the porch with his rifle. Clara beside him, not holding the skillet this time, holding the second rifle with a steadiness that Decker clocked immediately, and did not like. Pruitt, standing to the left of the porch steps, with a badge pinned to his coat, not the territorial marshal, but a deputized representative, and the badge was enough. The merchant. 2 of the landholders. And Gerald Fitch, who had ridden out for the first time in 11 years of post office routine, sitting on the wagon that had brought them all. Holding a shotgun with the uncomfortable grip of a man who never expected to use one, and was resolved to anyway. Decker stopped his horse at the tree line. Looked at the assembled group. Did his calculation. The numbers were even. More importantly, the presence of Pruitt's badge changed the nature of any violence, made it witnessed, official, prosecutable in a way that the earlier killings, staged to look like accidents, had not been. Elias walked down the porch steps. He'd thought for 9 days about this moment. About what a man says when the thing he's been afraid of finally arrives at full size, in full light, and has to be looked at directly. He'd thought about the 15 years of Jacob Rourke. About the things he'd done that he couldn't undo. About whether a man who built a house could actually become the man the house was built for, or whether the past had a gravity that always, eventually, pulled you back. He walked to within 10 feet of Decker's horse and stopped. "Those men who died," Elias said. "Thomas Greer. Pete Endale. The Voss brothers. Their names are in a wire to Santa Fe right now, along with yours. Along with testimony from people who saw your riders on those properties in the days before each death." Decker's face was very still. "This land isn't moving," Elias said. "Neither is anyone else's. And anything that happens to anyone in this valley from here on out, anything at all, has your name on it in a federal record before it's even finished happening." He paused. "That's a different situation than you had last month. You think a badge and a wire stops anything?" Decker said. "I think you're too smart to spend it all on 12 acres, Elias said. "I think you know when a play is finished." A long silence. The wind moved through the high desert grass, the dry whispering of it the only sound. Then Decker Munn did the last thing Elias expected. He laughed. It was a real laugh, short, but genuine. Not the laugh of a man who's defeated. The laugh of a man who's reassessing, and finding the reassessment actually interesting. "You changed," Decker said. "Jacob Rourke would have met me on the ridge in the dark and this would have gone differently." "Jacob Rourke's dead," Elias said. Decker looked at him for a long moment. Then his gaze moved to the porch, where Clara stood with the rifle, watching everything with those steady, measuring eyes. Something moved across Decker's face that Elias couldn't quite read, not respect, exactly. More like acknowledgement. The recognition of a factor he hadn't fully weighted. Decker said. He pulled his horse around. He said nothing else. He rode back up the trail, and his 7 men followed, and the sound of hooves faded out into the wide, indifferent desert. No one moved for a long moment. Then Gerald Fitch exhaled so loudly it was almost a laugh, and the tension broke. And people started talking all at once in the way that people do when the thing they feared has passed and the relief is almost physical. Elias walked back to the porch. Clara had lowered the rifle. She looked at him with those precise, undeceived eyes. "Is it finished?" she asked. He thought carefully. "For now," he said. "Decker won't stop being Decker. But he'll go find an easier play. We made this one cost too much." She nodded. "Absorbed this. Then, and the name? Jacob Rourke?" He looked at her. "You heard that." "I heard everything." She wasn't asking a question. She wasn't accusing. She was simply marking the territory of what she now knew. "I was a different man," he said. "I won't tell you the things I did were nothing. They weren't nothing. But I've spent 6 years, I know," she said. "You can't know yet," I know enough, Clara said. I know what kind of man builds a house like this one. I know what kind of man lets a town of strangers stand on his porch to protect each other. I know what kind of man tells the truth to a woman he met 3 weeks ago, when the easier thing would have been to say nothing. She looked out at the land, the 12 acres of red clay and high grass. An afternoon light. A man is more than his worst chapter. Elias said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish it. The sun was moving west. The others were loading back onto Gerald's wagon, talking quietly, doing the small human accounting of a crisis survived. The land lay around them in its permanent, unhurried way, the land that had been there before all of them, and would be there after. Clara went back inside to start supper. Elias sat down on the porch and looked east at the horizon, the direction the morning light would come from, the direction he'd faced the house deliberately, the direction that had always, for reasons he'd never quite examined, felt to him like the direction of beginning rather than ending. He thought about the letter that had arrived on a Tuesday with no postmark, and how it had almost made him fold everything up and run. He thought about what running would have cost. Not the land was land. But the particular, irreplaceable thing that had walked off a stagecoach from El Paso and stood on his porch with a cast iron skillet and asked 3 armed men if they were staying for supper. You don't build a house like this for lumber and glass. You build it because you're betting that life has something left in it worth building toward. Decker Munn would face a federal investigation within the month. The wire to Santa Fe had done its work. 2 of his men would testify in exchange for reduced charges. The land grabs would unravel. His operation would collapse the way operations built on fear always eventually collapse, all at once, and from the inside. Elias Cade would not be called to testify. His new name would hold. Whether that was justice or just good fortune, he could never quite decide. But here is what he knew. That evening, at a table set for 2 in a house he had built from the ground up with 2 years of solitary, stubborn hope, he sat across from a woman who had ridden into danger with her eyes open and called it home anyway. They ate together, and talked, and the lamp burned in the window, and outside the desert night settled around the house like a kept promise. There are men in this world who spend their whole lives outrunning who they used to be. And there are moments, rare, unearned, given by something larger than circumstance, when the running stops. Not because the past is gone. Because something in the present is finally more real than it. Elias Cade had been Jacob Rourke. Jacob Rourke had done things that couldn't be undone. But Elias Cade had built a house. And Clara Marsh had walked in and called it home. And sometimes, not always, not often, but sometimes, that is enough. The question this story leaves behind isn't whether Elias deserved what he found. It's something harder than that. It's whether a person can build their way into a better version of themselves, or whether what they build only reveals who they already were, waiting underneath all that rubble to finally come forward. What do you think? Was Elias honest enough, or did Clara deserve to know everything before she ever stepped off that stagecoach? The house is still standing, they say, out there in the high desert, facing east.